Welcome everybody. Wonderful to see so many of you here this morning. I take it that indicates interest in the topic of the seminar and in the work that Andrew Wilder at my side here has been conducting over the past couple of years. My name is Christian Berg Harpviken. I am the director of PRIO. This seminar is a seminar in the joint Afghanistan seminar series of the Christian Michelsen Institute and PRIO. We have had a number of seminars and we are going to have a number of seminars. In fact, having Andrew here now is the second time that he speaks in this series. He was here in March 2008. I had to check because I thought it was last fall actually. Then he talked about police reform in a public seminar, but in fact already then we had a little closed lunch gathering in which he laid out the design for the study that he's going to talk about today. So it's very nice, Andrew, to be able to welcome you back. I also understand that your recent visit resulted in closer relationships with Norwegian funding sources.
Thank you very much.
Very happy to note that. It's always nice when it works out that way and good initiatives gets the support that they deserve. Few words about Andrew. Andrew is currently a research director for policy processes at the Feinstein Center at Tufts University in the US, where he has been since early 2007. Prior to that, he led the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit in Kabul, which was, I think, the first independent think tank that was set up in Kabul after 9/11, 2001. Tremendously important intellectual environment that's been feeding into a variety of policy processes in Kabul over the past 8 years. I first met Andrew, in fact, in Islamabad, I think it was, pretty exactly 20 years ago. By then he had already spent decades in the region where he grew up, and at that time had already headed various humanitarian and development organizations for a number of years. So Pakistan and Afghanistan is his part of the world. Andrew also holds a doctorate in political science, again from Tufts University, but this time from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, which is about Pakistani electoral politics, and is also the basis for the book The Pakistani Voter, which was published on Oxford University Press in '99. But today it's about winning hearts and minds. We'll first give the floor to Andrew, who'll be talking for not exactly as long as he wants, but some 40 minutes in that range. Then we're also lucky enough to have Paul Engberg Pedersen, who I'll say a little bit more about later, as a discussant. Paul is the head of the Norwegian Agency for Development here in Oslo, so highly relevant both by position and by expertise. But now, Andrew, as a nice run-up to the debates on Afghanistan that we will all be exposed to over the next few days as the London conference takes off, discussing Afghanistan's future, you'll talk about hearts and minds.
And the first thing I need is some technical assistance on how to open a Norwegian water bottle. Sorry. Rather than make a mess and humiliate myself. Thank you. Problem with academics.
Well, you know, I used to be a farmer, so I can deal with that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, PRIO, for giving me this opportunity to speak. And I would welcome coming whenever you want, if afterwards I end up getting, generous donor contributions. My last visit here, as you mentioned, 2 years ago, I was able to present the idea of what I wanted to research, which then actually did lead to some very generous funding from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for this research. The research is also supported by the government in Sweden and Australia and the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit in Kabul. What I'd like to speak on is this whole assumptions around aid and security, aid and stabilization, which we're hearing more and more about, certainly in the U.S. It's to some extent a civil military issue, but I'm very carefully, my focus has not been looking at this issue from a humanitarian principles angle, which has had a lot of debate and discussion. But I'm approaching this issue from aid effectiveness angle because there has been lots of work on aid effectiveness when it comes to humanitarian and development assistance and its impact in terms of promoting humanitarian and development objectives. But there's actually been remarkably little research on how effective is aid in promoting stabilization and security objectives. And certainly in the U.S., with more and more of our foreign aid programmed very explicitly now to achieve stabilization objectives in contexts like Iraq and Afghanistan and now Pakistan, I think there's an urgent need to try to get much better sense of how effective is aid in achieving these objectives. And so that's been the focus of the research. We've, for the last 18 months, been doing field research in 5 provinces in Afghanistan, and I'm, in fact, tomorrow heading back to Afghanistan to hopefully finish the last of that field research. We've also been doing the research in the Horn of Africa, in particular in northeast Kenya, where the Joint Task Force Horn of Africa has had civil CIMIC teams in doing Hearts and Minds projects along the Somali border. And the next phase of this research will be shifting more focus to Pakistan. The assumption, again, is that aid is an effective stabilization tool. And hardly a day goes by in the press or in statements that this issue does not come up, whether it's aid and security are two sides of the same coin, or the famous, the current U.S. ambassador in Afghanistan, who used to be the head of the coalition forces, famously talked about where the road ends, the Taliban begin. Last April, the U.S. military published its handbook for commanders on a guide to money as a weapon system. So very explicitly felt that the aid money and project aid can be used very specifically to achieve our stabilization benefits. But I wanted to highlight that this is not just a military assumption. This is also an assumption held by many development actors about the ability of development assistance to promote peace, to promote security, and often the debate is not that it has a stabilization or security benefit, it's who should be doing it. So whether it should be the military doing it or civilian actors, which, as I said, is not the focus of my research, but again to highlight that this assumption around the stabilizing role of aid is very widely held across civil and military lines. I was in Rosgan province in the south in July. This was at the Dutch-led PRT. This is the kind of posters you see up around in the PRT itself, very much, again, reflecting this assumption that basically, okay, if we provide people jobs, then they won't fight, reflecting this assumption. This assumption is having major policy impacts, certainly in the U.S., not the first one being lots more money for development. The development sector has actually overall benefited tremendously in financial terms. The U.S., we've seen the largest increase in development budgets since 9/11, since the Cold War era. It's also resulting in a lot higher percentage of U.S. Development assistance being programmed now to achieve security and stabilization objectives. I don't have the absolute latest figures, but roughly you could say that probably 50% of U.S. foreign aid or more now is spent in 5 countries around the world. Israel, Egypt, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iraq. But then even within Afghanistan, you see the vast majority of U.S. aid programmed to the insecure areas. And in 2007, the NGO coordinating body working in Afghanistan did a study showing that more than 50% of the entire U.S. aid budget was spent in 4 provinces of southern Afghanistan, and the remaining in the remaining 30 provinces. And I also saw a figure that the U.S. has spent more in Helmand province alone than in an entire northern region of Afghanistan. So again, a big impact in terms of where the money gets spent. I should also say the latest General McChrystal's review, which was leaked to the press last fall, suggests that this will become even more of the focus. They want even more focus of U.S. development aid into the insecure areas. And USAID, the mission director in Kabul, co-authored an article last month called A New Approach to USAID's work, which also is very explicit that the objective of the USAID in Afghanistan is to support the U.S.'s overall counter-insurgency objectives in Afghanistan. So again, aid very explicitly linked to the counter-insurgency policy rather than say first and foremost to promote development objectives. Sorry, and the third one is the growing importance of a military as a development actor in Afghanistan. And as more and more money gets spent in insecure areas where often there isn't many other implementing agencies operating, we're seeing a significant increase in the amount of development assistance channeled through military actors or civil military actors like the provincial reconstruction teams or PRTs. And I think this is most vividly illustrated by the Commander's Emergency Response Program, or CERP, budget. So this is basically the fund or slush fund that the American military commanders have in the field for sort of hearts and minds projects. And we've seen a dramatic increase in this from virtually zero in 2002, 2003 when it started to nearly a doubling every year. And last year's budget was between $600 to $700 million, which again largely programmed where the U.S. military has its PRTs. And this, in 2010, this budget is now going to double again to $1.2 billion for the CERP budget. And again, also more globally, I don't have the latest figures, but you can, from this graph, see the trend of how USAID's share of official development assistance in America is decreasing over time while the Department of Defense is growing. And I think if we had current figures, that trend would have increased even more. In terms of the research, what we're coming up is several key areas where we think that this assumption is that aid programs have a stabilizing effect in Afghanistan is questionable. And the first one is the idea that poverty and lack of reconstruction are significant drivers of the conflict and the insurgency. And I'll come back to this a bit later in terms of some of the research and what people are saying are drivers of the conflict. But there's this very strong assumption that reconstruction and modernization are stabilizing, and that a lot of the conflict is a result of poverty and people and unemployment issues. The second one is the belief in a sort of a linear causal relationship between reconstruction aid, economic development, and stabilization. And some of this comes back from old modernization theory, from the 50s and 60s, and when I talk to PRT commanders in the South, it's very much, we're going to build a road. This road is going to lead to economic development in this area, and that is then going to lead to security and stability. A very linear model and somewhat ahistorical. The third assumption is that aid wins hearts and minds. It's quite remarkable to me, having been a development worker for much of my life, that generally aid, you shouldn't go into the business to become popular because it often gets people upset and has. But there is this very strong assumption at senior policy levels that if we give people things, they will like us or like their government. And again, the research doesn't show that that is the case. And then the fourth assumption is that extending the reach of the central government in Afghanistan contributes to stabilization. And this indeed is the #1 objective of the stated objective of the provincial reconstruction teams in Afghanistan, is to extend the reach of the central government because that is believed to be stabilizing. And again, I would say that that's a questionable assumption. I think if you look at the historical evidence, just starting with that, Astri Surkey has actually done some of the interesting work, highlighting how modernization, if anything in Afghanistan, looking back at its history, has been a destabilizing force. I mean, if you go back to the 1920s when King Amanullah was in power, he sort of pushed an Ataturk-style modernization agenda, which led to a reaction from the much more conservative rural hinterland and eventually led to his overthrow. Now, that's a very simplistic assessment of the 1920s in Afghanistan. But again, arguably, again, the modernization efforts created new social forces and unrest. Moving up to the 60s and 70s in Afghanistan, Afghanistan was one of the largest per capita recipients of foreign aid. In the Cold War efforts to win hearts and minds in Afghanistan, the Soviet Union and the US both had large-scale aid programs in Afghanistan during that period. And it's very hard to look back at that period, and there was many positive development outcomes from those investments, but certainly it's hard to look back and see that those were stabilizing. And I like to use the example of Kabul University there, where again, a highly successful effort by USAID invested a lot in developing the capacity of Kabul University and transformed it certainly into Afghanistan's premier institution of higher learning. But Kabul University also played an important role in generating sort of the leftist movement and the extreme right movement in Afghanistan, which arguably contributed quite a bit to the last 3 decades of conflict in Afghanistan. You had the Islamist movement emerge out of Kabul University. Many of the leaders of Gulbuddin Hikmatyar, Ahmad Shah Massoud, these people joined that group at Kabul University, as well as the Communist Party. USAID, I came across an interesting document published in 1988 when the Soviets had announced that they were going to withdraw from Afghanistan. A USAID officer in Islamabad at the time, which was managing the cross-border aid programs, hired some consultants to look back at the lessons from USAID's programs in Afghanistan from 1950 to 1979 to see what lessons can we learn from that period to inform what was viewed as a new large-scale U.S. aid program in Afghanistan once the Soviet withdrew. The communist government was perceived to collapse, then the USAID would move back with a big program, and what should they be doing? There was a lot of very interesting findings from this document, which clearly highlight how lessons can be observed, but they are very rarely learned. But the key finding, I thought, from this study was this quote, basically arguing that we shouldn't have unrealistic expectations of what development aid can do in terms of political objectives. So high expectations had been placed on what our development aid could do in terms of the Cold War objectives in the 60s and 70s. And I think it's very relevant also today that we risk setting up development to fail by expecting it to deliver in terms of political and security objectives in areas for which development aid is often not well suited. Also, I think on the historical side, I think the 80s, it's an under-researched area in terms of the Soviet experience of trying to win hearts and minds with large-scale investments of foreign aid, large-scale infrastructure projects. At a certain time in the 80s, there was over 2,000 Soviet economic advisors in Afghanistan, which in some ways dwarfs our civilian surge that we're talking about now. But again, hard to look back to that and see that there was much in the way of stabilization benefits that emerged from that. So again, a fairly consistent finding. History does not suggest in Afghanistan that aid programs have played a significant role in terms of promoting stabilization or security. Another poster from the PRT in Rozgan. Again, I mean, here indeed the kids do look rather happy with their pencils, but here's a $7,500 Hearts and Minds project.
Where are the glass beads?
Hmm?
Where are the glass beads?
In terms of moving on now to our key research findings. The research has been qualitative in nature, conducting interviews in these provinces and trying to find out what are the, starting off perceptions, again, what's been causing insecurity in the Afghan context. The number one cause that has come up in our research is actually the government, and bad government and corruption and the perception that a corrupt and predatory police force. And so again, very consistently in our research, people tend to blame the ineffectiveness of the government as a major cause of insecurity in Afghanistan, rather than, say, the effectiveness of the Taliban. One tribal elder in Paktia said, "Paktia has lots of problems, but the issue of lack of clinics, schools, and roads are not the problem. The main problem is we don't have a good government. Without a clean government, millions of dollars are stolen. If you increase the amount of money, it will also be useless because the government will simply steal more. There's a growing distance between the people and the government, and this is the main cause of the deteriorating security situation." So again, a second cause was international forces. They themselves were viewed as a cause of insecurity, sometimes very directly due to some of the civilian casualties issues, the operations of special forces, night raids on houses, a perceived disrespect for local culture, the arrest and detention policies where, a lot of the people I've interviewed in Paktia province have relatives who have been arrested and sent to Bagram Air Base detention, held a couple years and then released. And I think that's generated a lot of ill will. But also just the sheer fact of international military presence arriving often then serves as a magnet for Taliban attacks. And so a perception that international forces are destabilizing. Neighboring countries comes up very frequently in people being diplomatic and those being less diplomatic. Basically, Pakistan is that, the worst areas, not coincidentally, are along the Pakistan border in terms of security and the perception of Pakistan intelligence agencies and their role in fueling the conflict. Unemployment comes up very frequently in the interviews, and this is the one area that does have a relationship with the issue of aid. But when we actually dig deep on that issue, it then gets a bit more confusing because there's lots of unemployed and underemployed in Afghanistan, and the vast majority of those don't join the insurgency. Again, we don't have that much in the way of correlations between the poorest areas of Afghanistan are often the most secure areas, not the least secure. So I think it's a confusing issue. And also, the remedy for this is these cash for work programs, is that we'll hire people for a couple months or a few weeks and pay them $5 a day to work on a road project. But I'm still not quite sure how that would, someone earning $5 a day, there's nothing to stop them from taking $200 or $300 to lay an IED in the road. So it's a confusing issue, but it does come up in the research, this issue of unemployment. Ethnicity comes out very strongly as a cause of conflict. Certainly in the South, there's a sense that ethnic minority groups have become disproportionately strong, and in particular in terms of their influence in the security forces, whether the intelligence, the police, or the army. There's a feeling that Tajiks in particular have become disproportionately powerful. Of course, if you go to the north, you have a different perspective, and there's still a perception that a lot of the insecurity is caused by Pashtun, who are sympathetic to the Taliban. So again, ethnicity plays a major role. Inter and intra-tribal disputes are a big cause, certainly in Paktia province, where I've been doing research. In some of the districts that are ethnically homogeneous, there tends to be less trouble. Those that are much more fragmented tribal systems, one group gets support from the government or ISAF, the other groups go to the Taliban to get their support in terms of local tribal disputes. The Taliban come up as a cause of insecurity, and then other factors including democracy. I mean, the idea that in a way democracy is spreading anarchy and the freedom to do whatever you want. One quote I have is, "Now we have democracy. People do whatever they want. They loot, they steal, and only think about themselves." But anyway, the point being is in the research on what is causing insecurity, it's a lot of factors, and of them, only one is somewhat related to the issue directly of development assistance in terms of how most of the U.S. development dollars, say, are being spent in the South in terms of road building projects, infrastructure projects, roads, clinics, schools. And presumably then, if our aid is not really addressing the conflict drivers, then it's still I'm puzzled by these assumptions about how aid programs are going to be very decisive in terms of their impact on the insurgency. In addition to perceptions of security and insecurity, we then look at what are the perceptions of aid and aid actors. And this gets to this assumption that aid projects win hearts and minds and make people like us and make people happy or help legitimize the government. And yet we find that a deeply problematic assumption because aid is highly unpopular in Afghanistan. Aid effort is very negatively perceived, in general, and for a whole variety of reasons. But you sit down in these interviews and you hear a long litany of complaints about everything that's wrong with the aid program, starting with nothing has been done, when actually probably more has been done in the last 8 years than in any other period in Afghanistan's history. And certainly having worked in Afghanistan in the 80s and 90s, it's clear that lots has been done in the last decade there in terms of infrastructure, in terms of the health system, education, communications revolution, roads. But again, a perception that nothing's been done or not enough has been done comes out in a lot of the interviews, which again I think is linked to the issue of expectations, but it raises the issue, well, how much is actually enough to achieve stabilization benefits? A very common thing that comes up is they got more than we did. And I think it's a big problem in a society often tribally divided or ethnically polarized where you sort of have a zero-sum mentality that anyone else's gain is your loss. And it's very difficult to do aid programs there without creating this dynamic. You build a well in one village, 10 other villages are unhappy they didn't get one. Or you build a road up one valley, then people on the other side of the valley are unhappy that they didn't get it. And so it's very difficult to manage those kind of expectations. What has been done is poor quality, comes out very quickly. And I think a lot of this has to do with the short-term nature, the quick impact programs, the desire to get things done quickly. In some ways, I think a false sense of urgency, but also the contracting mechanisms where often the name of the game in Afghanistan is to win the contract for a donor, say, to build a road, but then you sell the contract off, and many of these construction companies are owned by some of the political elite in Kabul or their relatives. Because of their connections, they'll win the contract, they'll then sell it off to another contractor who then sells it off to another. And by the time you get to the 4th or 5th level of these contracts being sold, there's not actually enough money to do the project properly. And so often it leads to poor quality, schools being built fall down the next year, some of the roads are crumbling after a short period of time. So what in the first 2 or 3 months looked good, 1 year later is then pointed to as an example of corruption or poor quality or inappropriate projects. And inappropriateness of projects also comes up. There's quite a desire for large-scale infrastructure programs, or in particular things like factories and dams. And why aren't you building more factories and dams? And instead you're doing all these small-scale little projects, and we want these big projects, in particular things that will generate jobs in terms of the factories. Corruption comes up in just about every interview. Major problem in terms of perceptions, that just about everything done requires bribes or kickbacks to win the contracts, and so that's a major issue. Perception, a lot of money wasted, lots of broken promises. This is, I think, a particular problem with the quick rotation in PRTs, where you'll have a commander and his team come in on a 9-month duration. They'll arrive, they'll go out, determine all these needs, come up with projects. But if the projects haven't actually been started, when they rotate out and the next team comes in, there's no requirement for them to do what the previous rotation had committed to. They'll finish what was started, but often then they'll start their own priorities. And so often it does lead to this sense of broken promises. Complaints about too little employment of workers, too little consultation with local communities. Again, and the list goes on and on and on. And again, very rarely in these meetings do you have people coming back to you saying about how grateful they are for all the wonderful things that have been done for them, or how pleased they are, and here, take my heart and mind. I mean, that doesn't come out, that sense in the interviews. And just to give you a sense, a bit of how this dynamic plays out, I was in Rosegun in July and talked to a government official there who was responsible for building some roads, and he was tearing his hair out with frustration. He said, people always have lots of problems and complaints about our work and make problems for us. He said, we built a graveled road, and the people were complaining that they should get paid and compensated because this road passed through their area. He said, but this road was to benefit them. They even took their complaint up to the minister level. He said, there are also social problems when we try to do projects. When we build roads, people are always complaining. Some want the road here, some want it there. They are always complaining that the other side got more benefit than they did. As soon as we started to build a bridge in this one town, everyone, the commanders, the district governor, the Talibs, the Afghan National Police, everyone, all came asking for money. I gathered everyone and asked them, do you want this bridge or not? They said yes. So I made them sign a statement saying they wanted the bridge. Even still, I had to pay the police for security for our project to build the bridge. And so the sense of frustration by, here's a government official trying to do development work, and just the challenges, again, and keeping people happy in this process. So again, we shouldn't assume aid makes people happy, wins hearts and minds, or again, has this legitimizing effect on government. Not surprisingly, the perceptions also reflect then negatively on aid actors, and that's fairly universal. That's the military, the PRTs, the contractors, the NGOs, the government, all of those implementing projects are all perceived relatively negatively in terms of their role in this, what's viewed as a largely corrupt and ineffective aid effort. One notable exception was the National Solidarity Program. And some of you might be familiar with that program, but that is a large-scale national program run through the Ministry of Rural Reconstruction and Development. But then the implementation is largely contracted out to NGOs and contractors. But there's a process involved with it, going into a village, organizing a community. They have these elections that create these community development committees. These CDCs then have a role in prioritizing projects. Then this relatively small amount of money of, say, $30,000 is given as a block grant for the community prioritized projects. They're involved in the implementation and the oversight. And again, there's problems. But overall, of the programs that come up in our interviews, these are relatively well perceived. And again, I think it's sort of Community Development 101. If you talk to the communities involved, then we tend to have better development outcomes. And I think there have been better development outcomes. However, we still don't come up with evidence of better security outcomes. So even when you do have well-perceived development programs with positive development outcomes, and I think health is another example of this, that doesn't seem to be translating into people attributing that to the government or the international community, or having any significant stabilization benefit. If I could just move on now, not only has our research found that aid isn't stabilizing, but increasingly in areas of the South, there seems to be evidence of aid being actually destabilizing. And I think this has different facets to it. One is, again, this creation of winners and losers, which I mentioned earlier. That, for example, in Rosegun province, where I've been working, one tribe is perceived that was politically well connected to the president. He appointed Popolzai as the governor. The governor then had a nephew who has a militia. The governor subsequently is no longer the governor, but this one Popolzai tribe has the largest construction company, so they get the big construction contracts. They have the largest militia, which some people call an illegal militia, some people call a legal militia, but basically it gets the contracts to provide protection to convoys supplying the PRT. It gets contracts from U.S. Special Forces to escort some of their convoys. For road building projects, they get the contract. So anyway, one group has gotten quite powerful, which then some of the other tribes have then gone to the Taliban to get some of their political support in terms of their local tribal disputes in Rozgan province. So again, this is one way I think aid can be destabilizing by some people feeling that others are getting disproportionately powerful. Again, the whole political economy of aid and security contracting, and this is an area which I think is very belatedly getting more attention, mostly in the press, but I think it's an area that requires more in-depth research, which in a way is sort of the mafiaization of the construction sector. I mean, a lot of the key political elites in Kabul do have these companies and then subcontract, but in the insecure areas, there's growing evidence that significant amounts of money are actually paid to the Taliban as protection money. And if you're going to build a road in a highly insecure area where the Taliban have a lot of influence, it makes a lot of sense to have a deal with them, not to shoot you or your workers as you're building a road through those areas. And there was a recent press account quoting a U.S. Department of Defense official in Kabul estimating that 10% of U.S. logistics money contracting, which amounts, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars in logistical contracting, actually goes to the Taliban. So I think it's very plausible that donor aid is one of the top sources of revenue for the Taliban today, say maybe along with drugs or financing from Gulf states. And I think that's an area that hasn't gotten enough attention. And just one anecdote from a press account saying, one Afghan contractor, speaking privately, told friends of one project he was overseeing in the volatile South. I was building a bridge, he said one evening over drinks. The local Taliban commander called and said, don't build a bridge there, we'll have to blow it up. I asked him to let me finish the bridge, collect the money, then they could blow it up whenever they wanted. We agreed and I completed my project. But again, so I think that's, and certainly in our research we hear tales like this, and I can't say it's, what's true, what's not true, or the exact volume of it, but it would be very surprising to me if a lot of these kind of the political economy of aid is not fueling some of the whole war economy that's flourishing with aid contracting and security contracting, I think is destabilizing. But the number one issue which I think is destabilizing in aid is the whole role of corruption. And I think this leads to the conference coming up in the coming days, where I think you'll hear more lecturing of the Afghan government about how terrible corruption is, and there's been a lot of that. But I think that, well, I think there is true, and we need to be trying to hold the Afghan government more to account in some of these areas. I think there needs to be a lot more reflection on the role of donors and donor money in fueling corruption. There's two sides to the story. And if you give large amounts of money to be spent quickly in highly insecure areas with limited implementation capacity, limited oversight capacity, a limited ability to institutional and human resource capacity, it's nearly inevitably going to fuel corruption. And so this is where, if we're really bothered by corruption and think it's a very serious problem, which I do, in some of these areas, maybe the best solution is to spend less money and give less money, because this money is, I think, fueling corruption, which is delegitimizing the government, which is, I think, one of the major causes of instability. And I think this is particularly true of the South and Southeast, where the sheer volume of aid going through these PRTs is quite phenomenal. I mean, the Paktia PRT, where I was doing research last year, its budget was 60-70 million just during their 9-month duration. And that's a lot of money to spend effectively in these kind of environments. So again, just to highlight that the potentially destabilizing role of roads and of aid, and I think particularly I was going to say of roads, because this is where the majority of U.S. government money in the South is being spent through these Commanders Emergency Response Program, and to some extent based on these assumptions that where the road ends, the Taliban begin, which I don't really understand, because none of these roads we built are safe enough for me to travel on. There's lots of areas of Afghanistan with no roads and no Taliban, and a lot of areas with roads and Taliban. So, but it's often still quoted, and again, this assumption that these roads are stabilizing. And I think I like this cartoon because I think it challenges that assumption to some extent. And also in my research in Gardez, there's a big $100 million road project from Costa Gardez, which was contracted out to Louis Berger, a big American construction company. They then subcontracted it out to an Indian company headed by a retired Indian colonel from the Indian Army. Well, if you want to build a road to the Pakistan border, you probably shouldn't give the contract to an Indian company headed by a colonel, or else you're sort of asking for trouble from the ISI. And so I think some of these assumptions, I think, you know, are really simplistic when you start looking at how this actually plays out in reality. And just to wind up, I think one thing that does come out of research is I think where hearts and minds are won is actually back at home. And I think a lot of this assumption about winning hearts and minds is true, but much more for our domestic audience. This aid money does play an important role in terms of legitimizing to domestic audiences why our troops are in Afghanistan. And I think particularly in Europe, that, you know, the rationale for deploying troops was that we're going there to nation build and promote peace and stability, and therefore to be seen to be doing these things is important to legitimize troop presence. It's also good for troop morale, and I think certainly I've interviewed some of the National Guardsmen returning to Afghanistan, and their best memories of being in Afghanistan is when they were actually out there doing some of these projects or handing out soccer balls, and again, so it does play you know, important hearts and minds role, but I think probably more so back at home. And I thought just to end with this slide has been circulating on the net a bit recently, but this issue of, came out of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This is our stabilization strategy for Afghanistan. And this is part of a 35-page document, which has lots more of this. But I just wanted to highlight down here, and is infrastructure, services, and economy. And this is the role the infrastructure does to generate the popular support. And just to show that this is very, again, central to coin doctrine. Which I find quite amazing because the stakes are high in Afghanistan. Lots have been invested. Chances of failure are very real. Lots of time, effort, money spent in review after review after review. But the fundamental assumption of aid's role in stabilizing Afghanistan doesn't seem to get challenged at that top level. And yet, when I do give presentations like this to military audiences or in Afghanistan, I actually don't get much pushback. In fact, I get much more pushback from development actors and construction actors than I do from the military. And yet the ability for the research to actually influence strategy at the top level, that it's quite puzzling to me that for something so important to our strategy, which has so little evidence base, that I'm still puzzling over how that can happen. And given the stakes in Afghanistan, and the answer instead seems to be put even more money into it. So the CERT budget is being doubled this year in Afghanistan. The AID budget is probably going to be doubled for Afghanistan. And so throw more money at the problem, which seems to be what policymakers feel that's what you do to show something's important, even if it doesn't seem to have any positive outcomes and maybe be having negative outcomes. And so I'm very much in the less is more camp, as you can tell from the presentation. But I wanted to emphasize that that's much more, the focus of my research has been in the South, so much of this has been much more directed at those, and in particular the U.S. operating in the South. I think for a Norwegian audience and Norway, which is more working in the North, I think there's quite a different set of issues up there. I think there are some issues of relevance from this to the work there, but it's a very different dynamic than I think what we're seeing in the South. And I'll leave this up there. We can talk about it in question and answers. Here are just some preliminary recommendations coming out of the research. But I think I'll leave that for now and turn it over to you, and then hopefully have some good discussion about this afterwards. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew, for a very interesting presentation. We now turn the floor over to Paul Engberg Pedersen, who is the director of NORAD, the Norwegian Agency for International Development. He's not only the director of a very relevant agency when it comes to debating and formulating policy on development in Norway. He also has a strong background in this area. He has a doctorate in political science and policy planning from Roskilde University, and has published a number of texts, including one prominent textbook on development issues. And Paul, wonderful to have you here, and we look forward to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. And thanks very much for the invitation to come and, and discuss with you. I think what I really liked about the figure that you had before there, if you can get it back, just is this title here, Working Draft. Right? So there's hope still that we can get something out of that mess. It actually looks quite a lot when I give my normal speech on how development aid has progressed since the 60s and 70s. I end up with that figure, and it's quite deliberate to show that international aid has become much too complex. So this really resonates with me, that this is absurd in terms of thinking of what we can do in a context like that. I think, Andrew, that that what you have been telling us is incredibly useful research. We really like this kind of, at least I do, this kind of work. I think the very fact that you've talked to and with some Afghan people, that you've actually gone out and engaged in a dialogue and tried to see what are their perceptions, what are their aspirations, what are their wishes, and so on, I think is really incredibly important. We had a discussion yesterday in the ministry and NORAD, where some of my NORAD colleagues said that they had gone out and talked to some people about the same issues. And they managed to talk a bit more to some women than I think you had, where most of your informants are from the elite. And they'd gotten slightly different responses to what you were saying. So, of course, always when we have good research, we need to go down and look at the methodology. And this is not at all to dismiss anything of what you're saying, but this is to say that this is probably not the full story, but definitely a major part of it. There are many things I like about what you were saying. I fully agree with the fact that poverty is not the source of conflict around the world. That's definitely not the case. There are so many other reasons why people become engaged in conflicts or become terrorists or whatever. So fully agree on that. I fully agree that roads are not stabilizing in and of themselves, almost to the contrary. And I think that cartoon you showed of Taliban moving quickly around, I fully agree with it. And yet our problem, of course, is that we still do need roads in order for also some farmers to get access to a market and so on. So actually, we have to get roads into areas. Even if we, of course, know that they are being used for all kinds of purposes. I first and foremost agree very much with your assessment that the expectations of aid are simply excessive. And that is really key in everything that we're doing, trying to be more realistic of what is it that we can use aid for and what is it that we cannot expect it to be a good tool for. So these are some of the things I agree very much. There are some differences, as you pointed out, to the Norwegian setting. One of them is, of course, that this transfer of aid in the US from USAID to Pentagon has not happened in Norway. It's not so that the military and the PRT is handling the bulk of Norwegian aid, which is 750 million Norwegian kroner to Afghanistan. So that has not happened. We still have a problem, I think, in Norwegian aid, also to Afghanistan and to other places all over, that we have a multitude of objectives. There are too many objectives. Again, coming back to your point about too high expectations. We are struggling with the fact that whenever our politicians see a problem around the world, it's clear that they use aid for that for engaging in that. And I'm happy with the fact that they do that, because it does mean that we are getting a entry point to actually do something. It does mean that they are using one of their most effective tools, namely aid. But it also does mean that we often have multiple objectives. We cannot focus only, in quotation mark, on poverty reduction. We have to deal with all these other objectives. So we have some of the same issues, but not the same institutional impact that you were talking about, that the military is taking over aid in the Norwegian context. I think basically what your story tells us is something that we are reminding ourselves all the time, namely that local politics is much more important than global politics, and much more important than what we can do with aid. You have been doing comparative studies with the Horn of Africa, and some of you know that I started out in Ethiopia back in 1977 as a pretty young guy. I will never forget the fact that what happened between Ethiopia and Somalia at that time. Suddenly they switched. The rulers of Ethiopia switched. Ethiopia had been allied with the US. Somalia had been allied with the Soviet Union. And almost overnight, while they were fighting among themselves, Ethiopia and Somalia, they switched allegiance. So Ethiopia suddenly became part of the Soviet camp, and Somalia part of the US camp. So you actually had Ethiopian soldiers using Soviet guns, being advised by American soldiers on how they should beat Somalia, using American guns, fighting Ethiopia with the Russian advisors. So it was, I mean, that lesson was very telling for me as a young man, saying the only way you can explain that is really that local politics is more important than everything that is happening up there. And even today in Ethiopia, which you see the fact that the ethnic conflicts between the Amharas and the Tigres that go back at least 600, 700, 800 years or more, they are dominant in terms of whether they actually achieve state building and whether they achieve development and so on. So again, we simply have to recognize that local issues and local politics are more important than what we come and do. So I like the brain lessons. If we then look at your conclusions, I think they are incredibly useful and very sobering. Now clearly, as you also said, we are not in Afghanistan to be part of a popularity contest to win the hearts and minds. I would never use that frame. But it's true also that if that perception of aid is as widespread as you seem to indicate, then it is a major issue, because if we don't see a more positive takeover by Afghans, whatever they are, institutions or people, then it'll not be sustainable. We know that. So it's not in order to win the hearts and minds, it's actually out of effectiveness issues that this is a major problem, if it's so that they have these perceptions of what we do in Afghanistan. So I think it is very important. It's not strange to understand that it happens. I mean, we are, and perhaps that's what I'm lacking a little bit in your analysis. We are talking about a country where there is no state, basically, where everybody is at war with each other, where there is no security, where there is corruption all over, where there is no service coming out. Now, since we are there, if I were one of these Afghans you were talking to, of course I would have a negative perception of the donors who are there coming in, because we do take over some responsibility of actually delivering services. And when you do that in a context like in Afghanistan, of course they will have a negative perception of us. So it's not surprising, but again, as I say, it is a very big challenge. So what your lessons actually tell us is the one that I think you also agree with, is we simply have to make sure that we use aid as effectively as possible for the purposes it can be used for, and not for a lot of other purposes. That, I think, is the main lesson. We have to base our aid on using the institutions that are there, whether they are state institutions, whether they are traditional leaders, whatever they are. That's one of the basic lessons we've learned over the past 50, 60 years. base what you're doing on the existing institutions, existing structures, communities, and whatever. We have to do that. We have to focus on implementation. The devil is in the detail. We have to focus on follow-up. It's evident that in a structure, in a country where there is no structure, sustainable structure, we simply have to go out. I fully agree with you. To just let it go and throw in money and hope for the best is undermining, to a large degree, what it is we achieve. So I agree very much with that. We have to look at absorptive capacity, and we have to try to build capacity when we see that there is no capacity. Fully agree. A lot of money is coming in the form of aid. A lot of it is outside budget. Some of it is on budget. Norway is trying to increase the share that goes on budget, meaning going through Afghan institutions, even if we know that they are very weak. And when we push for that, we have to ensure that that the World Bank, who is managing it, that the UN, who is managing it, are emphasizing capacity building in the institutions there. If we don't do it, we end up with all the difficult issues that you are raising. We have to understand conflicts. The good old principle 20 years ago of do no harm when you are engaged in a situation like that is very simple to say and incredibly difficult to achieve, but we have to focus on it. We have to understand the causes of insecurity. I think it is very important. It's not unique to Afghanistan. Whenever you go around the world and interview people, you will get different answers on what is it that makes us insecure. It can be unemployment, it can be police brutality, it can be corruption, it can be all these different kinds of things. It is really a bloody burden for us to have done this kind of work, to understand what is it that people are concerned about. It can be a school that is not functioning because the teachers have run away and done different jobs, or it can be something completely different. If we don't understand, if we come with preconceived ideas of what it is, then we are really failing. So, fully agree with that. We have to look at what can we do with humanitarian assistance, what can we do with development assistance. They have different possibilities and different, what it is we can achieve with them. Different channels also. We have to distinguish and be quite clear on what it is we can do. I'll get back to that in the end. We have to be very transparent, and the reason I wanted to put this one up there, we have to be very simple. I mean, this is absurd, right? And as I said, I'm giving this speech always on the international aid system also. And we are putting the most complex systems on top of the weakest systems in the world. I mean, that's absurd. Even in Norway, if you ask some part of Norway to manage according to this, none of us would be able to it, right? So it really, there is some very, very negative tendency in international interventions to make things simply too complex. And we really have to, sometimes when I'm in an honest mood, I try to use my job to throw in a few hand grenades in these kind of systems. But I don't want to use that picture in Afghanistan, but mental hand grenades in order to make sure that we actually simplify the aid system. That is a major objective. So if we say we achieve that and you move on to your next, that one, I would agree with all of these in terms of saying that these are ways we should improve our aid in the case of Afghanistan and elsewhere. But the simple answer is that even if we do that, we still have to be there. We still have to do it. The option, I know this is simple to say to you because I don't expect you to give the answer to that, but the option of staying out is not there. We don't have an option to say right now, you can take care of yourself in Afghanistan. We don't have that for humanitarian reasons. As soon as we see that it's so much simpler in Haiti, even if it's going to be very difficult to rebuild there. But the humanitarian principle of saying we actually have to be where the problems are the biggest, I think is so important that the option of saying, well, less is more and therefore let's stay away, is not really an option. And then we have to look at the situations. And let me just use one other example. Zimbabwe. That's also right now a failing state. But there are some aspirations, some hopes, and so on. I must admit, I thought that we should actually try to be in Zimbabwe all the time, all the way through. And I think that when our politicians say, no, now Mugabe is too bad, so we have to stay out, we cannot give money, then I actually, as a professional, I disagree. Because what is interesting in Zimbabwe is that they have a core capacity to actually use aid. They can actually use it. And we can work with them in the health sector, in food distribution, in agriculture, and so on, and then get some progress. It will not have an impact on democracy. We cannot change the mind of Mugabe. Only age and God can do that, if he dies soon. So we cannot do anything, but we can work with the people that are actually delivering services, whether it's in the state or outside the state, and so on. And if we remember these other principles on how to work that. So that's the situation, but of course, as your bridge example from Afghanistan shows, it is more difficult. Even the worst thing we say about Mugabe, he is not blowing up bridges. He's coming close, but he's not doing that, right? Like the example of Taliban. So Afghanistan is really a situation incredibly different from many other parts. So we have to, from our aid side, I'll finish soon, distinguish between what we can do in the humanitarian field. We have to be there. We cannot avoid it. Now, I know that the Norwegian NGOs cannot reach most of Afghanistan right now for security reasons. That's a disaster, but what can we do otherwise than try to work with them, and they work with their local partners. Work with the UN, who has a mandate in the humanitarian field. Again, the UN has been kicked out of Kabul. Basically, that's a major challenge, but we have to, I don't see any real alternative. On the development side, there are aspects of education, even that is very controversial in Norway. How can education be so controversial as it is in Afghanistan? Well, it is, but we have to do it. Even infrastructure, as you've given example of, but again, I can't see no alternative. When we're trying to engage in fragile states like Afghanistan, we're trying to link state building and peace building, at least at the theoretical level and level of principles. Why do we do that? We do it because, and here perhaps I'm saying something coming close to winning hearts and minds, though I don't want to use that phrase. We do it because if there is no legitimacy in the population vis-a-vis the authorities, vis-a-vis the state, then there is no sustainability. So we have to somehow work on legitimacy and accountability of the state while building the state at the same time. We do believe that it is possible to actually work on some elements of state building. For example, issues like you emphasized, the budget, issues, the fact that if we can just develop a little bit more a transparent budget in the situation of Afghanistan so that people can actually start perhaps developing a political process around that budget, disagree and agree on some things. That in itself is a technocratic dimension of state building that perhaps is acceptable to most people, and I do think we need to emphasize these kind of approaches. So I do think that what we are trying to do in Afghanistan is almost impossible, but aid is still, as far as I can see, the most effective and best instrument we have. Despite this, if we recognize clearly what it is we can achieve with humanitarian, with development, and with state building different objectives. Last point, which comes back to the issue of what can we otherwise do. Now, if you took out the aid effectiveness debate and said, let's look at that in relationship to Afghanistan, very good that you're doing that, fully agree. And you're also very honest and clear in saying that you look at aid effectiveness vis-a-vis stabilization, not aid effectiveness in other purposes. If we just look at the aid effectiveness debate, then it's clear that if we wanted aid, and there is pressure on us to do that, to contribute as much as possible, to move as many as possible out of poverty, then we should give all Norwegian aid to India. Because India is a very effective country, very good governance, still with a lot of poverty, many more poor people than in Afghanistan. So if we want to see Norwegian aid going to a place where we can then say, for the 27 million Norwegian kroner, we got this many people out of poverty, we should probably give it all to India. Now, this is absurd. Point one, because India doesn't want any Norwegian aid. They want to do it themselves, which is fine. But they should do it a bit quicker so they get more people out of poverty. But anyway, but it's also absurd because that's not the objectives of Norwegian aid program, to give it to a place like India. Our objective is to use aid in these impossible cases, and therefore fully agree with your underlining assumption that we still have to use aid there. You don't disagree with that. You're telling us to use it in a smarter way, in a more effective way, and I just say I want to agree with your points on how to do it there. Yes, thank you.